Lorraine Hansberry, world-renowned author of a popular play, A Raisin in the Sun, a groundbreaking piece that ran miles in the marathon that is racial injustice. Lorraine is looked at today with the big names of civil rights activism. But that is not where our story begins. Way back when Lorraine was just 7 years old in 1937.
Even before then, Lorraine was born in 1930, youngest of 4 children. Her mother, Perry Hansberry, and her father, Carl Augustus Hansberry, raised their family in Chicago. Her father, Carl, founded Lake Street Bank, one of the first banks for African Americans in the 30s to 40s.
Keep in mind, at the time, African American voices carried substantially less than the rest of Chicago, whether that's political or just mundane tasks, but most of all, as far as property and real estate. That's partially why Lake Street Bank was so influential. Also, during this period, many major Chicago institutions were expanding.
Many people were displaced, but they called it rehabilitation. The majority of those who were quote-unquote rehabilitated were African Americans. They were usually sent to large public homes or had to survive in poverty. The Hansberry, money-wise, were pretty comfortable, and they, like many black families, were in search of a home.
The family sought residence at 6140 South Rhodes Avenue in Chicago. Carl, being a real estate developer, was rather excited to have this opportunity. This building, since 2010, has been labeled an official Chicago landmark and was inspiration for Lorraine's famed play, A Raisin in the Sun.
The family was moved in and ready for action by 1937, and had around a year of grace. But that's when things got sticky. Harassment from neighbors became almost a weekly tradition, and the racially motivated neighbors sometimes even came to violence. But we'll talk more about that later.
First, we're going to talk about redlining. Redlining is an act of denying a person a loan, even if they are qualified to receive one, due to a severe factor. They essentially divided the city into a scale, most hazardous to least. And guess how hazard levels were decided? The race of the population. But it did not end there.
Not only were they classified, but their classifications had many issues involved. One being, if you were in a, quote, hazardous region, banks could deny you loans. Living in a declining area justified you ineligible to receive loans, resources, and many more basic human needs.
Along with redlining, the world was faced with more racial roadblocks. The Jim Crow laws were set in place and were at its peak in the 1940s. These laws took segregation to a whole new level. They segregated schools, libraries, and even playgrounds. They instituted colored versus white signs in public areas. This family was quite literally living in a racially discriminated apocalyptic society.
Carl Hansberry was a real estate developer, so this outbreak was difficult for the family. The neighbors' harassment had reached an all-time high, and at this point in 1937, a brick was thrown through their window. The neighbors' anger was fueled by the thought of the Hansberrys breaking the all-white track record of this building. The family went against the racial covenant that was placed on the property.
So this brick set out the domino chain. Like, would you stay in your living situation where people wanted to kill you if necessary to rid of your company? Would you sit still? I think not. That sparked 3 years of intense racial battle for this historic family.
Let's meet a very important person in this story, Joseph Lee, who was a white homeowner in a neighborhood near Washington Park, Chicago. He also led a quite successful life, but he then caught word of some broken racial covenants. He learned that the Hansberrys were indeed disobeying these racial rules. Joseph took immediate action, hoping to rid of this innocent family.
He used a racial covenant to enforce eviction upon these helpless people. He used and abused a right he was given by prying rights from others. So, Carl acted on his responsibilities to protect his family, his people, and his pride. Because silence is a stem of ignorance, he wasn't quite ready to give up the fight.
3 years. 3 years of struggle, pain, and unfair treatment. As stated by Washington University, the use of racial restrictive covenants was promoted in the first instance by real estate professionals, led by the American Board of Realtors. The ABR and its local affiliates conducted education campaigns starting in the 1920s and continuing into the 1950s to persuade land developers, neighborhood associations, and individual property owners to quote-unquote protect property with racially restrictive covenants.
That's essentially describing how these covenants were not only allowed, but they were suggested. Pitching ensured safety with the catch of evicting all African Americans in the area. And keep in mind, this is the 1940s, right smack dab in the middle of this quote-unquote protection.
And so, the action began. The Hansberry family made the rightful decision to take this disruption to court. They worked with famed civil rights attorney Earl B. Dickerson, the recently appointed president of the Chicago Urban League. The court date was then set, and the defenders included Carl, of course, as well as the seller of the land. And so, time went on, and the date eventually arrived.
Here's where the good news, bad news came in. No, they didn't get a helpful response from the court date in Chicago, but the good news is that the holding progressed to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. This case was just taken from a level 2 to a level 10 in instance. The date was October 25th, 1940, when it occurred. The court holding was as follows. The Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits a judgment in a class action from binding an individual whose interests were not adequately represented in the class action.
With Chief Justice Charles E. Hughes leading the case, the process was issued, and after a long, difficult court date, we finally got no answer. It wasn't until 18 days later, on November 12, 1940, that the court came to a decision. According to U.F. Davis Law Review, the United States Supreme Court reversed, holding that the state's court's application of res judicata violated the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court stated that members of the class in Burke v. Kleeman would have had conflicting interests. Some signatories to the covenant would have wanted it to be enforced, and some signatories would not have wanted it to be enforced.
What that essentially means is that the United States Supreme Court changed their mind. Crazy, right? They saw that as long as this hearing laid under the 14th Amendment, it was unfair and unruly. They thought that racial covenants violated the rules stated by the United States of America, and thank goodness this was so.
As far as African American rights go, this was a huge step for this community. There are so many examples of these triumphs across the world at this time, even when the Jim Crow laws were at its peak, like we said before. This was a win for mankind as we know it.
But here is where things get quite sad. You know, there's a reason Lorraine wrote A Raisin in the Sun. These difficulties were far from over. Even though the court case was successful, the court decided that racially restrictive covenants went against previously created laws. Not much truly changed. It isn't as if racism was suddenly outlawed.
For decades after, thousands still suffered from racist endeavors. The trial in which Carl Augustus Hansberry went against Joseph Lee to demand freedom and triumph against racial injustice in everyday life is a perfect example of someone engaging in his rights and responsibilities. Hansberry's right to advocate for his equal protection under the law and his responsibilities to stand under racial injustice, examples such as redlining from local banks, harassment from neighbors, and many other difficulties that inequality provokes.
So while this didn't particularly have the happiest of endings, it shows us how to make ripples in the world and make change when change is due. If we continue to act on the rights we possess and push forward with conviction and responsibility, sometimes it just takes a push in the right direction to make huge changes in the world.
All it takes is one moment of bravery. One decision to push forward despite the obstacles, to set something greater into motion. The ripples we create may start small, but they expand outward, touching lives and inspiring others in ways we may never fully realize. Change doesn't always announce itself loudly. It often begins quietly, with a single choice to act rather than to stand still. And while the path forward isn't always easy, history shows us that those who persist, who hold on to their convictions with unwavering determination, are the ones who shape the future. Thank you for joining us in this documentary about the Hansberry story, where persistence and determination paved the way for justice. Their courage not only helped dismantle restrictive covenants, but also inspired generations to keep pushing for equality. As we reflect on this legacy, we may carry forward the spirit of resilience and continue striving for a world where opportunity knows no barriers.